I know.
Yeah,
It's my
you
fla-
sounded
it's my
sick.
flowers.
Yeah.
It's my flowers, Michael. They're
You never know the power of Zoom, right?
exactly.
Okay. So Shayla's with us. Let's get started. Let's go live. Oh, God.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shayla. Have you been participating in the council, rental housing advisory council, or
In
tangential?
terms of in the very recent months, I have not been able to make those meetings, but over the past couple of years, yes, the health department has participated with Sean in the council and the work of the council.
And have you seen some of the most recent drafts of the bill? It's similar to last year's bill, and wondering, you're sort of on the way out in terms of statutory responsibility, but several members of the committee wanted to hear from you to make sure that the Department of Health was comfortable with the direction things were going with this bill.
Excellent. Yeah. I'm sorry. I just remembered I didn't state my name. I'm Shayla Livingston with the Vermont Department of Health, for the record. Yeah. And I appreciate you having me and bringing me in. And we have really appreciated the work of the council and the partnership with DPS and everybody else on the council in considering this and the best path forward. And the health department has reviewed some of the latest versions of the bill and offered a couple minor tweaks, but overall is comfortable. We have no objections at all to the direction that it is going right now.
Okay. A question I've asked a couple of times so far, and I guess I'm asking, in your whatever remaining role you would have in the law, given that the primary role would be with fire safety, your role in overseeing town health officers, I guess we have to decide, are we going to make a clean break here, which has its advantages, or are we going to leave some lingering power to the town health officers or the Department of Health to be consulted, to be backup, I mean, my own feeling is, I think I have to reread it, but the way it's written right now, it seems like there is some lingering authority without any clear definition of what the responsibility is in the town health officers and in the Department of Health. I could be wrong. I haven't read it clearly enough, but I wouldn't like it if we didn't clarify it better, because it could lead to potential confusion. And some of these cases could be really large injuries could result. And then you're going to have everybody scurrying around to avoid responsibility and pointing fingers at other people.
Absolutely. So I think, as David said earlier, we will retain the town health officers for other duties, responding to rabies, dog bites, that kind of thing, not related to rental housing. So they will continue to exist. I think that the health department and is comfortable removing them entirely from rental housing. I would want to defer to DPS and fire safety on, if they would want to consult with a town health officer at any point, or how they would want to or not want to have them involved. I would like to defer to him. I don't think that we have a strong opinion there. And I agree with you, Senator, that we want it to be clear what that role would be. I think this committee has heard many times from both town health officers themselves and the health department that it's just very variable right now across the state in terms of the town health officers' ability to respond, their availability, and also their whether or not they're even appointed and present at the time when they are needed. So because they're volunteers. So whatever that role would be, just would encourage it to not be a requirement, because that could be tricky across the state to implement.
So does,
evenly.
so does City of Burlington, I assume they have a town health officer, but do they ever get involved with the building code enforcement person, assuming they're not the same person? How does that work with towns that have their own professional staff right now?
Right, so the towns with professional rental inspection programs is different across each town. And I actually cannot speak specifically to Burlington. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I can look into that for you. Maybe Sean, Sean knows. I see he waved. So
He's got a smile on his face like he might be the town health officer. I don't know.
But I do think that in the cases where we have sort of, I'm going to just say quote unquote professional town health officers, folks who are in paid roles for their municipality, they are in most cases integrated into whatever that system is for rental and often fire safety inspection. Sean, can I defer? Can I call a friend, Senator?
No, let's just see if we can wrap this
Okay.
right up. I'm just trying to understand, we don't have to reinvent the wheel now in terms of this clarity. If there are protocols in place already for towns that have professional building inspectors, and how do they relate to the Department of Health and to local town health officers? So if you can address that, Sean, please jump in. It's timely.
Sure. So Sean Gilpin with the Department of Housing and Community Development, and one of the roles that I have at DHCD in my ever-growing job description is to staff the Rental Housing Advisory Board. In the case of Burlington specifically, they have a code enforcement office with Bill Ward as the head and several inspectors, and those inspectors are actually the town health officers. And I think that's typically the case in most, if not all, of the municipalities that have a code enforcement or quote unquote professionalized system. That inspector is the town health officer for the purposes of rental housing code enforcement.
I just want to chime in and say we do have a civilian board of health, and they in Burlington, and they don't really have a lot of jobs right now. That's sort of an ongoing thought and question. But Sean is right that our code enforcement officers are deputized to kind of serve in that role, so that gives them more power in their enforcement.
It concerns me that learning that there may be a need to tweak the statute somewhat to make it clear what the responsibilities are as to the city as a building code enforcer, and to the state and to the town as a town health officer, and where do they overlap? It seems like it doesn't sound like it's going to be hard to fix if it even needs fixing, but it does, in my mind, at least need a better understanding at this point as we go forward.
Senator, would you like me?
And coordination. I think you're right. I don't think it needs a fix, but it does need to be coordinated.
I can take that back to Mike DeRocher and just make sure that we have a clear message on that and whether or not we want to suggest any changes to that, what's written now in the bill, if that would be useful.
Well, it would be, but also take it back to the square right on top of it to Sean, because he's charged with the advisory council. And, maybe we're making a bigger issue of this than it is, but if in this statute it says town health officers still have this responsibility, except when there's a professional code enforcer, are we doing damage by doing that? Do we want to continue to have this person in two roles, and do they have different functions? And it's just a little confusing to me at this point. I'm not worried that we can't fix it, but I'm just, everybody's calling for clarity. In my mind, I don't have clarity quite yet. So, and we don't have to dwell on it today, but I think we've identified it as an issue, and I'm sure David Hall has made note of it as well. So, Keisha, Senator Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So first of all, I mentioned on the break, it would be great to hear from someone like Bill Ward, and Karen put the fire chief and health officer in St. Albans in the chat. Bill Ward is just a consummate professional and very clear in lines of communication as also a former law enforcement officer, same as the Marshfield gentleman. My question was kind of the opposite. I've just talked to a lot of folks in towns where they have a sewage backup in their basement and they don't know what the chain of command is for who to call and who will help them. And I don't know if this is a Wendy Morgan question or what, but I think we want that clarity for their sake. Who would be, if we have these, rental inspection folks, would they call their office? Would they start with local government? Where would they get help, which isn't a fire safety issue? It's like a indoor quality housing habitability issue. That happens, that I hear a lot all over the state.
I'll let Sean try and answer that, and Wendy can as well. I mean, we need to clear this kind of up. We're moving in a direction that I think is healthy. This is going to be a very major step forward in Vermont's housing stock, I think. It's long overdue, but we want to get it right. We don't want to have unintended consequences if we don't produce clarity in who's in charge of what going forward. Sean?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. So in the interest of clarity, and I had anticipated doing a little table setting at the beginning, but I'm happy that you folks have made time to hear from some of the people who have been on the Rental Housing Advisory Board. So just as a reminder of the committee, the board is made up of landlord advocates, tenant advocates, municipal representatives, and then a couple of at-large seats, which are occupied by Erhard Manka from the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition and Sarah Carpenter, formerly at the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. So I think and the membership also obviously includes Karen Horn from the League of Cities and Town, Wendy Morgan from Vermont Legal Aid, and Angela Zykowski from the Vermont Landlords Association. So I think it's safe to say that this, as has been mentioned earlier, is the bill before you is the result of an incredible amount of collaboration between various stakeholder groups. You all, the committee received a report back in January of 2019 that I'm happy to resend that articulates some of the work that was done. And this bill is really the result of a lot of that work. The reason, to go back and sort of answer the reason why we're recommending, or the board, I should say, is recommending, and to be clear, Shayla Livingston, as she mentioned, from Department of Health, has been closely involved with the conversations in 2018 and 2019, although like Mike DeRocha at Division of Fire Safety and the Department of Housing and Community Development, we have all been involved in the process, but are not actually members on the board, just to make sure that delineation is clear. The reason why this sort of isn't working, as has been mentioned, is, it's largely outside of the eight or so municipalities that have their own code enforcement system. It's largely volunteer. Oftentimes, it's, as James mentioned, it's folks who don't have an incredible amount of experience with these sort of technical systems, and also sometimes, in some towns, it ends up being the town health officer is related to the landlord or might be the landlord, and those cases come up more often than you'd expect, and obviously that conflict can really wreak havoc for a rental situation. So the reason why fire safety was brought up, or the question of why fire safety was brought up before, largely because, as was mentioned, there's a huge amount of overlap between what a town health officer has to look at in a rental inspection versus what fire safety would ultimately be called to evaluate. Electrical work, frankly, plumbing work actually in many cases falls to Division of Fire Safety as well, and obviously structural issues. I think there's about a 65 to 70% overlap in if you look at the checklist of what a town health officer is supposed to be looking at when they do an inspection and what is ultimately the authority of Division of Fire Safety. Fire safety has regional offices already, so there is some logistical benefit, infrastructure benefit of moving this responsibility over to them. They have 5 regional offices, or I believe it might even be more than 5. I'll defer to Mr. DeRocher, our Director DeRocher, on that. But what this bill does not do is completely remove the existence of town health officers. As has been noted, they deal with everything from dog bites to blue-green algae blooms to excessive garbage being left on the street. So attracting vermin and that sort of thing. So we're not necessarily replacing the town health officer system, but just taking away a pretty technical aspect and putting it into an organization that has technical expertise in that area. It also does not displace any of the MOUs that are already in place. So those 8 communities that already have their own code enforcement system would continue to operate relatively unchanged. The bill does, as was alluded to, it does actually represent long conversations with Mike DeRocher's team and fire safety generally about what the various elements of enforcement need to be. This doesn't actually change the warranty of habitability that's already there. So everything that's in this bill as far as what needs to be enforced is already enforceable by a town health officer. It's not changing any of the standards or what's being mandated for safe rental housing. So we have actually gone through line by line with Division of Fire Safety to talk about what elements that they would have to add. So to answer Senator Rahm's question about the septic backup, would probably be one of the things that would be added to that. Right now, a town health officer would be contacted first, and instead the call would go directly to Division of Fire Safety, because these inspectors would have sort of a broad training in not just fire safety elements, but also, and frankly, right now, fire safety already has plumbers on staff and other things like that, because water issues can become fire issues when you have electrical involved. So there are a small handful of things, namely vermin infestations is one, mold issues is another that fire safety would be training their people to understand and take on, which is the rationale for having additional inspectors to do this. Pretty much everything else, in reality, a town health officer often will see, old knob and tube wiring, for instance, and will end up calling fire safety anyway. So the town health officer really acts as just the truly just the inspector, and then has to refer out to more expertise. And we're taking out a bit of that middleman with this legislation. I do want to quickly touch on the ADU issue. I think that is language that needs some additional clarity. The intention of the Rental Housing Advisory Board was to ensure that the bill as proposed included accessory dwelling units themselves and the systems that touch them to be under the authority of Division of Fire Safety, but not necessarily the entire structure if the ADU is self-contained. So the example that Senator Sirotkin brought up, where maybe there's a shared electrical system, that electrical system would be under the jurisdiction of an inspection by fire safety. But in the case, for instance, if the structure is acting more like a traditional duplex, where you have sort of a self-contained rental unit separate from the single family unit that has its own electric meter, circuit breaker box and all that, then that unit would be treated like its own rental and the single family home would not be under the jurisdiction of fire safety. I do think there needs to be some clarity there. The question of fees came up. Why the $35? Really, it was largely the result of some discussions about what the range of fees are. There are communities like St. Johnsbury that has a relatively small, I think they only charge 15. And then Wendy's shaking her head. Okay, so St. Johnsbury charges 35. On sort of the other end of the spectrum is Burlington, which charges $110 annually per unit, unless it's owner occupied, and then there's a discount. It's only $85 if the building has an owner occupied unit. The fee was meant to be relatively little, but also enough to bring in the revenue needed to ultimately cover the 5 inspectors plus a little bit of extra in the hopes that the rental registry, which we've sort of touched on but haven't delved into that much, could actually also provide some incentives for landlords. So sort of to Senator Brock's point about being concerned about the increased professionality of enforcement causing individual property owners to potentially take units offline rather than do the upgrades. That is one of the reasons why the administration feels very strongly that the VHIP proposal ought to be married to this bill, because for exactly the situation that was described by Senator Brock, when a landlord who might not have the resources to actually make the upgrades that are necessary. And again, to clarify, these are not new regulations. These are things that needed to be in place already. However, we recognize the reality on the ground is that there might be instances where a more professional code enforcement officer might recognize things that ought to be fixed. And you may very well have a landlord who themselves is not particularly wealthy and needs assistance in order to make these code upgrades. And that's actually one of the reasons why this committee will recall the VHIP proposal was amended to not just deal with vacant or blighted units, which it was originally proposed as, but also to deal with code enforcement issues, because we felt that this was a necessary sort of flip side of having a professionalized code enforcement. Also bear in mind that
we did that in our bill last year, didn't we?
correct.
Okay.
And I think it's important to also point out that this proposal is not suggesting a Burlington style regular inspection protocol. In the city of Burlington, depending on whether or not you have code violations in a rental unit, you're inspected either annually or up to every 5 years if you sort of have a good track record. It's the time frame changes. This would not be a quote unquote proactive inspection regime. This would still be complaint based. So you would need to have a tenant or even a landlord in some cases. Sometimes landlords do end up calling code enforcement because a tenant is doing things like blocking egress or causing code violation issues. So it's not necessarily always a one-sided situation. And I think as proposed, a town health officer would also be somebody who would be able to make a complaint to the Division of Fire Safety, since they'll still exist but not have the responsibility of actually doing the inspection and doing the enforcement. And then just briefly, I think the rental registry is actually a huge component in this bill. I think that there has been a growing interest in having such a registry for a number of reasons, not least of which has actually less to do with code enforcement and more to do with our decision making when we're making public investments about where rental housing should go. The state, often through community development block grants, funnels a lot of federal dollars into planning purposes, to market studies, to understand what different municipalities need in terms of their rental housing, where VHCB should invest dollars, where community development block grant money should be invested. And by having a rental registry and understanding where rental units are, we could save an awful lot of money and put that funds into actual bricks and mortar instead of into market studies and hiring consultants. And further, I think it's very safe to say that if a rental registry had been in place for before the emergency rental assistance program or the rental housing stabilization program, we could have been much more efficient to reaching out to landlords to explain what their options were as far as getting unpaid rent covered by these programs. And I think I'm channeling Angela Zajkowski a little bit. I think having some sort of line of communication with landlords would actually also help us explain when these laws do change, because often, there are tweaks made to landlord-tenant law. And by and large, most landlords want to do it right and do it by the book, but are not necessarily professionalized. And being able to have a level of communication with the landlord community as the small businesses that they are would be really helpful, and a rental registry would go a ways towards that. However, we also recognize that needing to have, those are some of the carrots, so to speak, with a registry, and one of those ought to be resources available to address some of these code enforcement issues that are going to come up.
Senator Brock.
Question: as you look at linking this to the availability of funds for a landlord to do the repairs through VHIP or whatever, aren't there typically constraints that say that the tenant has to have a certain income level, or the landlord has to agree to rent to people at a certain income level over time? Is that the administration's concept of what ought to be in a VHIP program?
The current VHIP program as proposed does have not a limitation on the individual renter. It doesn't have a means testing, but it does have an affordability component going forward. So yes, it as currently proposed, it suggests that it requires that the rent be at HUD fair market rent or the availability of a housing choice voucher for a series of years. I think that as proposed, that VHIP component, the rental housing improvement component, is only one-time funding. So that would be an annual thing. I suspect that should the rental registry be created and this $35 fee be imposed, the thought process, if I can be so bold as to speak for the Rental Housing Advisory Board, the thought process was that after a certain number of years, with understanding that there won't be 100% compliance in year one, just because there needs to be some advocacy and understanding about what the expectations are, that after a certain number of years, there would be enough revenue from these fees to not only cover the inspection, but also to create let's say a VHIP light, if you will, that would allow for resources to be available to landlords who need them, and we could certainly negotiate how that's treated as far as affordability covenants and the like. So I think VHIP is sort of a starting point to pilot this type of program. But we ongoing would certainly like to have continued discussions about how best to bring units back online for landlords who have acted in good faith and need the resources.
Well, the thing that I'm also thinking about is the reverse of the typical situation, that if the rent is already for the tenants who are there exceeding the amount that would typically be authorized here, what happens?
Yeah, and in this case, with this certain proposal, that the rent would either need to be lowered or that be eligible. But I guess what I'm saying is, what I'd like to see is a more robust discussion about how, once we have the revenues coming in from this rental registry, how we can make those resources available. And that's,
I'm just thinking, is there a perverse situation that could develop given these restrictions, in which you have an existing tenant who has to move out for the renovations to be made, once the renovations are made and some state assistance is provided, would the landlord be required to lower the rent for the same tenant?
And that is certainly a situation that would need to be discussed. And I would like to hope that in most of these cases, it's not a situation where the renovation or the code renovation / code code compliance were so egregious that the tenant needed to vacate in order for them to be addressed. But recognize that, yeah, that is a situation that needs to be discussed.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna need to.
Michael, may I
Senator
just-
Clark, yes,
just on this issue of affordability and easing people into this, Sean, do you have any comments about the notion of a year where this service is offered for free, as St. Johnsbury did, to ease landlords, and all the rest of us into this new system?
Sure, that has been discussed, certainly.
Yeah, we discussed it last year too.
I honestly, I think there may be benefits. I know St. Johnsbury, there was a lot of reticence about it, and so that's why they took the tact that they did. But from what I've heard, it's been a rather successful program since then, and a lot of the landlords are actually grateful for having a clean bill of health that they can show if a tenant tries to make a claim that there's code violations and therefore rent can be withheld. So this is a tool that can protect either side of the landlord-tenant situation.
Yeah.
My concern about a sort of I don't know, year of amnesty or a free year for the registry is it will affect the sequencing of when we'll be able to have the revenues for actually
Right.
having inspection, having frankly the funds for an ongoing registry. So there's that question. I think it's an interesting one, but might affect how quickly we can roll out the full benefit of this proposal.
Right. Unless there were stimulus dollars to enable that. That might
No,
be.
we love those stimulus dollars, don't we?
Yeah.
so we're gonna get into stimulus dollars in a second. We're gonna talk a few more minutes and then take probably a 5 or 10 minute break. But Sean, you mentioned the rental registry and how useful that could have been on the past rental arrearage program and the bill going forward. I still don't have a handle on the 23 or $25 million that went out the door last year. What kind of penetration rate did we achieve? I've heard Josh talk about 75,000 rental units in the state of Vermont. Does anybody know how many rental units got assisted with that $25 million?
We do know. It's not immediately in front of me. There was about, let's see, there were at least 10,000 households that were served, likely a deal more than that. About 10,422 households were served by that, which represents a little over 23,000 tenants.
Does that 10,000 represent individual grantees, or could some of those 10,000 receive multiple grants?
Some of those 10,000s could have received multiple grants. Unfortunately, I don't have the number of unique households in front of me.
Okay, and your testimony is that if we had a rental registry, especially one that was electronic, we could reach out to a lot of the tenants and landlords and say, there's this incredible program out there that could help you, and you could benefit and pump money into the economy, put more food on your table, et cetera.
And cover your mortgage and your utility bills, because that's still a responsibility. I think it is important to remember that, of those 75,000 or so rental units, not everyone needed assistance. It's safe to say that, some folks did not lose their job or were not, financially affected by COVID-19 pandemic response. So I still think I think we, all that's to say, I think we should be proud of the penetration that did happen with the 22 million that went out. But yes, it could have been more efficient.
We could also say of the 75,000, many did not receive assisted, but took it anyhow.
That is a reality. We intentionally had pretty low means testing in order to get that out. I think the Vermont State Housing Authority did do a survey of landlords who were who accepted assistance on behalf of their tenants, and by and large, we have found that it's the 1 to 4 unit owners that were benefiting from the program. So I would go so far to say that this was as much a business stimulus as a tenant.
Well, there was some sort of means testing in the sense that the rent, to qualify for the program, the rent had to be within certain standards of the VSHA, right? So
Correct. The rent could not exceed the Vermont State Housing Authority payment standards, which by and large aligns with sort of the Section 8 payment standards. So one would, and since both a tenant and a landlord had to apply for the funds, one could assume that there were very few landlords of luxury apartments that were willing to cooperate if they were only going to get the VSHA payment standards.
okay. Senator Rahm.
Maybe it's in our materials, but when you get us more information about the number of units, I imagine it's pretty easy to determine the number of units that are listed on Airbnb, for example, because they all are tax filers now. Is that the case? Airbnb is collecting taxes from all of those units. Do we have that information?
So unfortunately,
we know we made that possible.
The tax department, not to disparage any of my colleagues over at the Department of Tax, but they tend to be a bit of a black box when it comes to their own data collection, and for legitimate reasons. So we do not have access to who is paying tax on Airbnb. We did recently, and we being the Department of Housing and Community Development, did recently commission a housing needs assessment, as we're required to for receipt of federal funds, that included some data from an outfit called AirDNA that compiles not just Airbnb, but Vrbo and a lot of other short-term rentals. So we do have some information on the number of short-term rentals, but we, as we discussed the last time, we would go a long way towards understanding that a little bit better with the type of rental registry that's being discussed in this bill. Recognizing that, as Senator Rahm, you noted last time around, the short-term rental does not always mean vacation rental. There are lots of other reasons for individuals to rent for relatively short periods of time.
And I think we could get some of that data. The JFO has an ability to penetrate that black box a little bit better, probably than you, Sean. And they integrate. Keisha, that might be a good question for JFO, because we've always talked about this universe of 76,000 units, and it's a good question. At what percent are short-term rentals?
And I'm happy to also share a link to the Vermont Housing Finance Agency's community profiles page has a visualization of the number of short-term rental units they understand to exist based on the AirDNA information.
Okay, this has been very helpful. I sense, after working on this for 3 years, a certain degree of enthusiasm and excitement to push this over the finish line. This year, money always helps. We'll take it up again next week. I hope the stakeholders will reconvene and present us with a memo of what changes or issues we still need to address here. A big one is whether and when we would marry a VHIP program with the rental registry and the code enforcement. In the past, the VHIP program has been floated more in the terms of a budget item. I'm not exactly sure how the governor has floated this year, though I know he has proposed one-time and ongoing money for VHIP. Whether we put it in this bill or not remains to be seen. There are definitely pros and cons I see, and we will have to have some further conversations. But I know I, for one, am supportive of the VHIP concept and have been, and I think most of the members of the committee are as well. There may be some tweaks we want to see in terms of how to target that money, but we will get into that next week. So let's take a 5-minute break and we'll go to the request of the Joint Fiscal Committee for our input on the $200 million emergency rental, housing, and utility program. We've talked about it before, but I want to take 15 minutes with the goal of getting to the end of that conversation and giving our thoughts over and to move on. And then after that, we'll hear about 15 or 20 minutes on an update on the 1099 issue at the unemployment office. So let's say 10:50 to reconvene. Thank you very, very much, everybody.